I am working on this particular design element on a particular project, and was running into trying to figure out how to pull this off. And so the essential concept is let me go back to the sort of the one line design where we have this hero image with a title, and the title sits in the bottom left hand corner. Now, the way I've normally seen this done is where you have sort of this fixed height, because it's an image. We know we can export that. We have a fixed height to it, and then we're going to absolutely position the element to the bottom. The problem with that is that the more text that we add to it, it's eventually going to go too high. Now, of course, it'd be great to go back to the content authors and say, hey, by the way, you should keep your titles short so that they don't expand across multiple lines. But as you can imagine, on larger projects with larger teams dealing with multiple languages, sometimes that doesn't always happen. And so in this particular case, let me give you a demonstration. We've got our one line example, our two line example. We got a bunch of lines, but we obviously don't want it to blow past. What we want it to do is actually grow down. And so what I've done here is I've had this little pink background so you can kind of see how it would actually push the container down, and thus the rest of the content down. We're not going to have this situation where it's not overlapping any content on the bottom. It's not overlapping any content on the top. We kind of have this flexible UI element, which is fantastic. And so if you've been kind of peeking up at this section up at the top, you'll probably notice that I decided to use Grid. And the way the grid essentially works is I create a container for that, and then with that, I use the align items end to align the items to the bottom. And therefore, essentially what will happen is the item will sit in that container, and it will continue to grow until it's maxed out its container, and then it will grow the container down. That's exactly what we want. And actually, the amount of code that I would need to pull that off would be relatively straightforward. But of course, client projects, we have to support browsers, including Internet Explorer. In this case, Internet Explorer 10 and 11. And the great thing is that we do have a grid implementation. Now, it doesn't have all the same features that the latest and greatest CSS Grid has, but let's step through a little bit of some of the stuff that I had to do. So, for example, we now need to say display grid, right, with the MS prefix on there. So that will allow this to work sort of in what we want to do. Now, the problem here is that the moment we define that, for some reason, min height no longer works. It completely ignores it with a grid implementation. So there's gotcha number one. Gotcha number two, align items wasn't supported in that particular implementation. So we need to kind of get around this somehow. And so I was thinking of some ideas and came up with one, which was to actually create a pseudo element and attach that into our container and set that to a height. So I set that to a specific height, and that'll stretch my container out to that minimum. And the great thing is with Grid, if we have multiple items, the container will expand to the height of the largest item in that container. So as I scroll down here, we have our actual content. I'll get to this a little bit, but I think the key thing I wanted to talk about was the pseudo element. So I decided, instead of using an HTML element, I created this after pseudo element, set it to content, set it to display block, and then I set the minimum height on this. And what that does is it'll actually create that sort of minimum height that I wanted for that hero image. And voila, everything was kind of working. Now, as you can imagine, the implementation between Microsoft's Grid implementation and the newer implementation that all the current browsers have, including Edge, is how elements are positioned on the grid. Now, in Internet Explorer 10 and 11, what happens is if you do not specify a grid row or column, it'll default to the first row and the first column. And basically all the elements will overlap. You actually have to be explicit into what cells you want those items to be in. And so in this particular case, I actually, that was the behavior that I wanted. I didn't care because I have this, there's nothing in there, right? There's no content, no border, no nothing. So this isn't actually visible in here. And that's okay. However, for the newer implementation, everything gets auto placed, and so it will try to auto stack the items, and thus you'll have the height of your cell title here, and then underneath that you would have the pseudo element that would blow the height of this, and obviously it wasn't working. So in this case, what I did is I said, okay, throw everything into the first row, and that way everything will size. Now, in this particular case, they're actually going to be beside each other, and I can kind of demonstrate that with a border 1 pixel solid blue. And when I do that, you'll notice it is in the same row, right? So even though it's got this little bit of sort of space reserved for it, we actually don't care. The more content I have here, let me go back down to the one line. You'll notice it now has that minimum height that was specified. Perfect. It has the space reserved that we care about. This is doing what we want it to do. So I will get rid of that since we don't need it. And I think we're in a pretty good place. So we had that grid row specified on both the grid there and on the content, making sure that they're both in the right place. Now, I mentioned before that align items and isn't supported in the Internet Explorer implementation, but you can align the individual items. And so the only one that admittedly that I care about aligning is the content. And so I've simply set that content as such. And so now what does this look like in Internet Explorer? So let's go to that. Boom. This is the implementation, same code pen, fantastic, in IE 10. And so we have the one line implementation, we've got the 2 line, we've got a bunch of lines, and we've got the so many lines, and it's doing exactly what we want. So with that, thank you very much and enjoy.